Okay, we're recording. It's February 13th. We're in New Braunfels with Mom and Dad, and Teddy had a soccer game today, and we're working on our oral history before we go off to the soccer game. And where we left off last time is Mom and Dad had told us about basically their lives up until college, and now we're going to step back to their early years and when they were kids and if they knew each other and then how they met. So let's start off with Mom. Tell me about what your early memories were of Dad when you guys were kids and growing up.
I remember Neil from kindergarten, and he was the politest boy in the class and very nice. And some of the boys were rowdy and kind of full of it, but he was always polite. And Mrs. Rivers, correct, liked him. And kindergarten was
and
fun.
I think Grandpa
Yes,
Libby or Uncle Brad both had Mrs. Rivers. She was a long time.
she had been there for years.
Long
She was gray-haired at the time, as I recall.
And then Dad, what's your memory of being a kid and having Mom living down the street, and what are your memories?
I think Ruthie was kind when she said I was polite. I was a pretty wimpy kid in kindergarten and grade school. I wasn't really in sports or 4-H or anything. And it wasn't really until high school where I sort of found my voice, actually, technically, and that I was in forensics and would speak up in class and ran for class or student council president on a campaign and won.
And the advisor hated you
Yeah.
because you weren't acquiescent. Or
No, and I wore purple pants and a ducktail haircut, and it was rock and roll time. But certainly, if you want to look at this, probably the singular most important thing from the grade school and high school years was meeting Ruth and dating Ruth and starting the foundation of a marriage that's going into 54 years. And that was, you know, by far the most significant thing.
When did y'all first date?
I recall junior in high school. Am I correct?
I think that's right.
This is putting you on the spot, but do you remember what the first date was? Or what is your recollection of the first date? Or a first
We
I
date?
think
went-
we went steady. I think you got
We
a
d-
class ring.
We did go steady. I can remember going to movies, and going to a movie in Madison was a big deal.
And you took a car in and...
Yes, and we did a lot of double dating with mainly Neil's friends, Carl and Connie Romstead and David Bly. And we did things with his friend Don Every.
Was there a homecoming or a prom that y'all went to?
I'm sure we went to homecoming and the prom. The prom the senior year. One of those proms, I had just had 4 wisdom teeth out, and I looked horrible. I was black and blue. They must have done a horrible job. Do you remember that? I was pathetic looking. And I remember another thing from grade school in the country school. Neil came to school for one day and visited, and we never saw him again. And I never knew what happened. But his dad, they paid for in-town tuition. And your dad took you to school, brought you home for lunch, took him after lunch, and brought you home again. Isn't that true?
Yep, for a long, long time. The old
Until
man
you
and-
drove.
You know, the old man and I sometimes would have a few hands of poker or roll dice at lunch, which was sort of funny. I can remember one date that we had, and we were going to go bowling. And I think it was on a Saturday. We had 2 in the afternoon, and we went bowling. And then we decided to go to a movie. And I suppose it got to be 5 or 6 hours that we were gone. And as we were walking out of the movie, your folks had seen the car and decided to check to make sure we were okay and sitting in the back of the theater,
I don't remember, isn't that fun? I don't remember that.
which was sort of funny. I think if, well, I might as well get it out. The only other person I really dated very much was Ruth's sister, and that was Ding. And that wasn't very long.
Was that during high school?
Yep,
Yeah,
it was.
Yeah.
Was I mad about that?
I think, you know, if the future kids look back, it's not with Ruth and I, but the lack of technology. We basically had the radio, and that's what you listen to the politics on, the Amos and Andy, the Shadow Nose, Bobby Benson and the B-Bar-B Writers.
Jack Benny,
Jack Benny.
High school would have been what years, roughly?
54 to 58.
Okay.
54 to 58. And, you know, historically, I can remember of keeping an album on Queen Elizabeth's coronation, and she was just a teenager.
That was 52 or something, I
Teenager
think.
at the time, and keeping an album of the Korean War and where the maps were and where the soldiers were and that kind of thing.
And you were in 4-H for 1 year, because I remember your mother told this hilarious story about in 4-H record books for the year were a big thing. And both you and she tried to draw a sheep on the record book. And I can't remember what it looked like.
A dog, maybe.
Neither
And
one of them could draw
I
a sheep.
was not very, I mean, with Ruth and her family and showing it, you know, international shows and that, my 4-H involvement was pretty pathetic. I can remember the dishes were big sheep people, and I was going to show a sheep. And they said, well, when you put your hand on it, put your hand on the chest and push up a little bit, and it'll level the back off, so it'll look like it's really a nice sheep, even if it is a little bowed. The old man said, Christ, it looked like a camel.
A camel.
Looked like a camel with all
Because he was pressing so hard.
I was pushing so hard. And I think, you know, living on a farm alone, you do get to be a little bit more of a loner. And then, you know, I did hunt a lot.
Tell me about that. I'm going to sidetrack, but tell me a little bit about your hunting trips with Grandpa
Well,
Libby.
I think, you know, when you, really two aspects. One, when you come home, and I was either working in the service station or working in the drugstore pretty much, but I did have a lot of time alone on the farm, and I'd grab my 1887 Marlin lever action 32 rimfire, which cost $2 a box for 50 shells, and you could buy 22 shells for about 49 cents a box. I didn't go blowing up beer cans, and it had a tube on it. I can remember that. But it would only take 2 rounds. You put 1 round in, put it in the chamber, and then put a second round in. And I had an old 16 gauge Stevens with a plastic stock, and I'd go pheasant hunting. And a few times, not many, probably half a dozen times, I'd come back with 2 rooster pheasants, and they were great to eat, and that was always fun. Dad Libby had hunted in the 30s before World War II, but by the time I come along, he was, you know, got into high school. He was in his early 50s. And we hunted some up in Jackson County with some of his buddies. And I can never forget went up, and the first deer that I shot was on a Sunday morning, and on a Saturday morning one of the other young guys in camp, 13 or 14, had taken a deer, and that was the only deer in camp, and of course he was the hero. And the next morning I shot a spike buck, so I was proud, and the old man was proud.
And the deer.
And he took up bow hunting.
Okay.
Mainly because there were so many hunters in the woods during gun season, and you could go in September and October when the weather was warmer, or there was actually a late season. And I can remember we hunted together, and the old man missed a shot at a 10-point buck, And he said, I'll never have a shot like that again in my life. And I said, oh yeah, Dad, of course you never did. Never did.
And one year, your dad and my dad went deer hunting together,
Yep.
and they got a cabin.
With Uncle Brad and Howie.
Okay, well, my dad loved to go hunting, but he never shot anything. I don't
Yeah.
think he was real keen on hunting. But they had this cabin, and our dads were together on this porch that
In Wisconsin in
in
the
Wisconsin, yeah, in November. And the other guys thought it was kind of cold, and they wanted to close the door to the porch. And the two fathers immediately said, "You'll close that door over our dead bodies," or something like that,
Why?
because it'd be so cold.
Oh.
If they
Cold,
if they
cold,
closed the
cold,
door on
cold.
that porch, they would have frozen.
I can remember on that hunt, it was like 5 above and the wind was blowing. And it come up in the morning and nobody was going to go hunting. Well, I was a college student, I was a high school student, and I said, I'm going to go out for 1 hour, 1 hour, and then I'm going to come back and have breakfast with the guys. So I gone out and I shot a buck. And I can remember Uncle Brad heard the shot. It must not have been 500 yards from camp, you know. Uncle Brad heard the shot, walked over, looked at it, said, nice deer, turned around and walked back to camp. If I was looking for help dressing it out or dragging it back, it was my problem, you know.
What was Evansville like in the 50s? Was it, a happening town, a boring town? Was it,
Small town. Wasn't really suburban
No.
Madison yet. It was small town.
I don't have that much to judge it by. We thought as we got older that it was very quiet and a little boring. But I think as far as small towns went, the school system was decent. A lot of kids went on to college. And that day, before we went to college, there were a lot of jobs. There was a highway trailer company, there was Chevrolet, the people that made the interiors for Chevrolet, that was Fisher Body, Forest Products in Madison.
And you still heard, Norwegian and German spoken with farmers in the evenings, on the street sometimes. And of course, I was working in the drugstore, so I knew, there were 2 drugstores in town, and one of the pharmacists was a Catholic, and then Arnie Willis or Bill Brown were Protestants, so we got all of the birth control business in town from the good Catholics. And, we had a bottle of white wine in a brown paper bag that the banker's wife would come in twice a week, and you never said anything. It's just when she came in, she'd buy something and you'd give her the bag and she'd take the white wine home. Or Frank Green would come down early in the morning and there'd be coins where people had just grabbed a newspaper, and he'd grab the coins and a newspaper and go over and have breakfast at the shop. But we talked to Ben, and Ben said, well, you just figure out what it is and bill me every month. So, being a small town, I was Doc Libby's boy, and I probably would have been Doc Libby's boy until I was 40 or 50, But you got to sort of know what was happening in the small town. The first drugstore had a fountain and marble floors, and we had vet goods, and I knew how to handle the calf scours or Russell Stover candy, or we had liquor, I knew, Muscatel versus port wines, and so it was an interesting experience for a kid. Kept me out of some of the school activities and sports, which I've come to realize can be an important part of growing up. Like cars. Cars were stick shift. They didn't have air conditioning.
It was an era where service meant something. It was before Walmart. And
Yeah.
Well, you'd go when I was young, into the grocery store, and everything would be behind the counter. and there wasn't a lot. But if you wanted a can of soup, or if you wanted milk, they went and got it for you and brought it out. And people still canned. They didn't, and had gardens, so you didn't just go in and shop at a supermarket.
And if you didn't have a lot of money and were sick, you went and saw the pharmacist, I got a bad cough, I got a bad cold, and we had a lot of over-the-counter stuff, so, there was more, service was important, and a lot of it was one-on-one, with, I think, has disappeared, certainly, from pharmacy.
And people made a living working in the hardware store, or working, the Grange store was the furniture and clothing store, or people worked in the supermarket and supported families. And there was usually one working person. Both our mothers went to work. My mother went to work when I was in 8th grade, worked part-time for a local attorney, became pretty adept at doing a lot of stuff because he was very political and was out of the office a lot. And your mother went to work in the library.
And I think she really enjoyed the library work. I think the economics in our family was the time that the money she earned, I'm sure it was limited, but I think it was certainly helpful. And it probably allowed her to, you remember some of the things she bought. She bought that cuckoo clock out of her own money, and she was so proud of that.
And when she'd decorate the house with her money.
Oh, just back to guns a little bit. Mother there was a chip in the window, which was obviously from a BB gun or pellet gun, and Dad was starting to chew on me, and Mother said, it could have been from hail. And then she had a Melmac plate, and on the back of it said, unbreakable. So I took it out and put it against a tree, and I had an old 8mm Mauser. It wasn't, it was 1,000 damn pieces, and I couldn't pick them all up, to completely camouflage my experiment, And we had rockets. That was the time of Sputnik
and we
stuff.
were about juniors in high school.
So me and Mike Sorkin, who was the doctor's son, and a couple of guys.
It was Carl and David.
And and Donnie Every, and Big Don was big. We made rockets with angle iron, and we had a launcher and wires, and we made a bunker back there with logs.
On your farm?
On the farm. And we used powder aluminum and sulfur.
Did you make your own engines back then?
Well, it was a tube that we put fins on with a nose, probably 4 or 5 feet long, and then in the base of it we had Don Every got something to set off flash bulbs that sparked, and we run cores back, and when you put them together it sent a spark, and we put off one and it went up a ways, and then we decided to make a huge one, so we made a bigger one, with more powder in it. And I don't know, I can't remember. We had some kids there. I don't know if you were there or Bonnie Templeton was there, and some of them, but we had this big rocket with the fins, and it went off. The problem was we'd welded the fins onto the pipe, and as the powdered aluminum and the propellant burned, it melted the weld and the fins dropped off. So when it got up to about maybe 75 feet, all of the fins were off, so the upward mobility had stopped, and it started tumbling with still flame shooting out about this far, hit the ground, set the grass on fire.
I do remember that.
Set the grass on fire, and we had to run over and beat out the fire on the ground. So we had a interesting time.
And what year did you graduate from high school?
58.
And were you all dating then?
Yes.
And then tell us about going off to college, and just tell us about your relationship, when you left for college.
Well, I think we went off, we weren't going steady or anything when we went off to college. Isn't that true? But we still dated.
Did you break up? Was there a
I don't-
breakup?
No, I don't think so. We
Just-
dated when we came back for Thanksgiving and
I,
Christmas.
I think your folks and you know, St. Olaf's was a wonderful school, and I think it was exciting that you could go. I think for money, the UW was probably the only option that I had, so we just went different directions.
But
And I didn't date.
we wrote letters.
Yeah, we wrote letters.
You came to visit me.
Come to visit you. Drove up. Can't remember. And I was in a scholarship house, which was certainly no fraternity house. Yeah, to get in, you had to have economic need, and you had to keep at least a B average. So the whole tenor in David Schreiner House was academic excellence. And if you got a C, it was, you know, an embarrassment, something to be ashamed of. So it was probably a great environment for a young student coming out of Evansville. I can remember Mother Libby said, well, I don't want him to work first semester. Well, I got a job at Thanksgiving and working in Rathskeller, bartending and shorter cook, that kind of thing.
But when did you all decide that you were going to make this thing stick?
Well, we agreed that Neil could not go to St. Olaf because they did not have a pharmacy or professional schools. And I think we mentioned this, I was ready to go to UW and have a few football games and have a little more, I don't know, college experience. And you proposed our junior year. You remember that, after Christmas?
But were you back in...
I was back in Madison then,
And do you have
living
a
in Chadburn House with a roommate that transferred with me from St. Olaf. You were living on Charter Street with Don Every and Carl Romstead.
And you were
in an
both
apartment.
juniors?
We were juniors, yep.
And then you proposed to Mom
Yep.
as a junior?
With a ring.
Well, let's
With the ring.
tell me
about the ring.
tell us about how you got the ring first, and then I want to hear about the actual proposing.
You tell about the ring.
It breaks your heart.
Just so you're
You do it so you're accurate,
Yeah.
but he had to sell every gun you owned.
Well, tell us about the gun collection, because that we haven't talked about
Well,
that.
there's a couple of them, you know. One, we got married 20 January, our second semester senior year, and we needed a car. And I had 4 or 5 guns at that time, including a pretty nice Luger. I can remember that. And I traded them to one of the fathers of one of the guys that I was in pharmacy school to run a used car lot. And that's where the famous 53 6-cylinder Ford coupe that wouldn't start in cold weather in Wisconsin came from, that had 4 flat tires on
And our honeymoon.
our honeymoon. And before that, I had amassed a few guns, sold those, and got... You're still wearing it.
Yes, my engagement ring.
Yes.
I was flabbergasted that I got a ring.
You weren't expecting it?
I was not expecting a ring. We planned on getting married and talked about that. But I got asked with the ring. And
Does anybody remember the actual moment where you were asked,
Oh.
or the ring? Was there a
there
presentation
was-
of the ring?
Yes, we did something, and then we went back to the apartment and you fixed dinner, right? And then we were sitting on the sofa and you brought out this box.
Yep. That's where it was. Smartest thing I ever did.
Well,
And my junior year was a turbulent year academically. Pharmacy was, I was the last of the 4-year programs. It went to 5, then 6 years, and then a 7-year PharmD program. So they packed in all kinds of stuff. And first 2 years were pretty much basic, got A's and B's, Schreiner House, moved in with the guys. Too much work, probably 30 hours a week, probably too much bars, something. Had 3rd semester organic chemistry, which was very difficult. was a hard year. Senior year, I got an apartment. Ruth was there. Got into pharmacy, pharmacology, pharmacognosy, pharmacy dispensing. Grades went back up to A and B. It wasn't still working. We both were working. You were working
I
at
worked
the cattle.
in the College of Agriculture in what they called the meat lab, where they did research on beef animals, which I'm sure didn't, my dad or somebody helped me get that job, but I was basically a secretary to one or more of the PhD students.
And your major was?
English and history with an education minor. And I had to do student teaching, didn't have a car. I think I did that my junior year.
How long was the engagement?
Well, about a year.
And was
Must
it,
have been.
Because we married in January.
did you set a date, or was it one of those, we're engaged and we'll get married when it works out?
Where did 20 January come from? I
was
guess it was close enough economically. We both had
We figured we could get
we
through.
both had a few $100s in the bank, and I had a job interning full-time in Evansville as a pharmacy graduate. So you had a year of work, and Ernie paid me $125 a week, which was good pay, $500 a month. We got a nice apartment on Main Street.
In Evansville.
In Evansville.
When you were married or as engaged?
No, we.
After we married.
Okay.
After we graduated.
After you graduated. Because I want to get to that, but I want to hear about the actual marriage ceremony, because I've never heard that story. So, but did you live together when you were engaged, or separate? Didn't just
We lived separately.
Okay.
We each had our own place. One of the reasons we got married in January, I can remember, people got married upon graduation. And the summer was full of weddings already. Carl and Connie were getting married. David and Norma were getting married. There were a lot of weddings.
Did we move right into the apartment on Main Street when we got married?
No, we lived on Bowen Court. We had the two.
We lived on Bowen Court. How can I
And my
forget?
roommate was leaving. So I wasn't going to have a roommate the second semester.
and that was your place, is Bowen Court? Or
No, that was a new apartment.
okay.
I lived in a dump the second year on Mill Street, which was a dump.
Bowen Street was a dump.
Yeah, but you were there. It was
Yeah.
much better.
So let's tell me about the actual marriage ceremony. Where was
We were
that?
married in the Lutheran Church
In Evansville?
in Evansville. It had been built a couple of years before, so it was very new. It wasn't completely finished. I don't think they had the carpeting in.
Who showed up for the wedding?
Well, the organist showed up late.
Yes,
I remember that.
because
Everything
we were
was set.
married at 7:30, but she didn't get there till 7:20.
January 20th,
1962.
1962.
And I had my cousin Sue and Barb and Catherine stand up with me. My cousin Sue was maid of honor, or matron of honor, because she was married. Because then I didn't have to choose between
Your
the
sisters.
sisters. And you had Carl.
Brad was the best man. Had Don Every, Carl.
Yes. And it was a Lutheran ceremony with
Snow in the
carols.
parking lot.
Carl Romsted's dad was the Lutheran minister who had been the minister since I was like 3. So I'd known him my whole life. It was a little sad. In those days, you picked a church, and then one of you changed if you weren't both Lutherans. And Neil was a Congregationalist, and he went to the Lutheran class.
Training program. I did. I did.
Yes.
That's right.
And Reverend Romsted was so upset when you didn't join. He went through the whole class, and he did not join the Lutheran Church. And I'm sure, and I wish I'd known more, I'm sure he felt he did something wrong. And he hadn't done anything wrong. It was just Neil was not a believer even back then. But we had the family and friends from college. But it was it was inexpensive because all the wedding was at 7:30, and then there was a reception at the church, and there was cake and ice cream and maybe small sandwiches. Go ahead.
This might hurt. January, we figured we had enough money to get to the end of the semester and then work. But the option of moving in with either of the parents, I don't.
But no, never
No.
came up.
No, that
Wasn't going to happen.
wasn't going to happen. No, I don't think we'd been invited, and we didn't expect it.
My mother knew a seamstress in Stoughton, where she was from. I think they'd known her for years. And my parents had no money then because Ding was in college, prices were down, but I wanted a velvet dress, and not velveteen, I wanted velvet. So we went to this seamstress, and she did do wedding dresses, and she bought the material. She made the wedding dress, and she made the velvet bridesmaids dresses for everybody.
And what did you do with your dress? Did you keep it for a while? Or?
I had it for years, and I don't really know what happened to it. But in
All
one
the
of
moves.
17 moves in the military, things get thinned out,
Was there a honeymoon? Immediately,
yes,
or
we
like-
had no money. Well, tell them what we
We
did.
went down to Galena, Illinois, Grant's home.
We started to take a trip down the Mississippi River, the scenic byway. But we hadn't gotten out of town 15, 20 miles, and we had the first flat tire. And it was cold. It was well below zero. And you said, I think we did have 4 flat tires.
At least 3.
And
Of course, it was a used car, and I think it didn't have very good rubber, and I think I went to a junkyard and picked out 3 or 4 tires that looked like they had tread. I mean, I probably needed Ricky or somebody to look at the damn tires, but they looked like they weren't bald. I mean, I'd say they're bald or have tread. Well, they must have been old or rotten or something, but it was fun. And we got to Galena.
What happened in Galena? What was in Galena?
Just Grant's home.
USSS Grant lived there. I don't know, before and after the Civil War?
Yeah.
I can't really remember now. And it was a scenic trip, and we just had the few days, then it was just a few days between semesters, and we started second semester.
Now my grades went up again, So.
Yes, you were, yeah.
And that was the second semester of your senior year.
Yes. And we graduated on time in June. And I got a job with Wisconsin Telephone Company because you had it wasn't a full year, was it? You had 9 months left of
3 months I worked in the drugstore
one summer.
between junior and senior year counted. And we got that nice upper half of a house on Main Street, certainly private bath, big dining, hardwood floors, I can remember that.
In Evansville.
In Evansville, right on Main Street.
Where did we get, was it furnished? It must have been furnished, because we didn't have enough money to buy furniture.
I don't think we had enough money to buy furniture.
Or groceries.
Yeah.
And-
Were you? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I worked in the store, and at some point, we traded off or sold the old Ford Coupe and got our first Volkswagen
But used,
used,
very used.
36 horsepower, sort of a forest green, bought it used from some hippies that said, well, it sort of looks like you could park it in the forest and you wouldn't see it.
Why you remember that?
I remember that. I don't think it'd give us much trouble, though.
And of course, we had one car. I rode back and forth to Madison with our friend Don Every, who was young Don's dad, and he was a friend of my dad. So it was all very intertwined. And I actually liked working at the telephone company. But we didn't know when, but we knew that Neil was going to go on orders to the Army.
It was during that time, we talked about it the other night, that we put in for the Peace
Peace
Corps.
Corps.
Well, Okay, tell me about that. Oh,
Well, it was John Kennedy, and ask not what you can do for your country, and I did not ask to get out of, I had been advanced ROTC, so I had, I think, a minimum of 2 years active duty required,
And you were commissioned
and I was commissioned
on graduation.
as a second lieutenant.
did Mom pin your bars on? Was there a
I
commissioning
was a
ceremony?
horrible ROTC, short, little, overweight, couldn't march, 3 stripes. But I don't think anybody put 4 years in ROTC and ended up with a buck sergeant, but I did, you know. Part of it I could march.
You know, we had the picture of the other promotions. I remember the Army promotions.
Yeah.
I do not remember the commissioning
Okay.
But we,
ceremony.
and anyway, that was 62, 63, and of course Vietnam was starting to warm up, and I doubt if they were,
We put an application in and contacted, it must have been by letter, wrote letters to, I don't know if it was to the ROTC office in Madison, and asked for a delay to active duty. That is all you asked for, so we could go into the Peace Corps. And basically they said no.
no. And in the interim time when that was working, I said, do you have any, I contacted them, any idea where we would be posted? And they said, not until you get your assignment, because they had a pharmacist and an English major, but they said 60% of our workers are going to Africa right now. So we never got a posting, turned it down, moved on. I can remember your dad was running for political office.
State representative
Mm-hmm.
in the Republican primary, which he lost. But it was a fun experience,
And
I
the
think.
widow
Carolyn Blanchard.
of the representative ran against him at the last minute or something. And, you know, it was
Name
recognition.
sympathy vote and name recognition.
What did you do for the phone company when you were?
I was a representative and helped people get new phones, transfer service, did some bill collection work, worked with business. Then I got a promotion, so I worked with, you know, you start out with residential customers.
Right.
And then I got a job in the business, setting up new businesses, determining, you know, what their service would be.
Yeah, good job for a recent college graduate. Go ahead.
Oh, at the end of that time, I had the state board examination, passed the state board, and I think salary went up to like $250 a week. I think it doubled
You mean from Arnie then?
from Arnie then. And we got our orders, U.S. Army Medical Training Center, Fort Sam, Houston. We started to see where Houston, Texas was, and then we figured out that Fort Sam was in
San Antonio. We could have started driving to Houston, but
And I was, you know, I was a pharmacist, so I showed him to Brad, who had been an enlisted man and also in the military police as an officer. And I said, well, you think I'll be going to the hospital and pharmacy? Yeah, I don't know. This looks like it's a basic training center, or maybe AIT, Advanced Individual Training. I don't see a lot of pharmacy or hospital work here, and he was right.
I want to hear about what your assignment was like when you got to Fort Sam, but I need to take a break for just a second.
Okay.